Guys, I'm really happy to welcome to the podcast my son-in-law, Brandon Gill. Brandon's the founder of DCinquirer.com. By the way, if you haven't seen it, DC Inquirer, ENQUIRER.com. It's a quickly growing conservative news outlet. He's originally a rancher from West Texas, a graduate of Dartmouth. That's where he met Danielle, my daughter. And he's a former Wall Street analyst. You can follow his political commentary and follow him on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, also Getter, Truth Social. He's at Real Brandon Gill. Hey, Brandon, good to see you. Thanks for coming on the podcast. I thought I'd talk to you a little bit about Wall Street. You've been an insider and an observer of Wall Street. And you were telling me about a kind of new activism that's emerging on Wall Street, allied with the left. It's a kind of almost a woke Wall Streetism. Talk a little bit about what are some of the signs of that, and then we can talk about how it became that way.
All right. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on the show, Dinesh. Always good to talk to you. As you mentioned, I grew up on a cattle ranch in West Texas, and I had always kind of been intrigued by Wall Street. It's an area where there's a certain sort of meritocratic purity to investing, or at least what I thought was how the investing world worked. Typically, you think of investing as you analyze a company, you analyze its fundamental business prospects, you estimate its future cash flow, and then come up with what you think that means the stock or business should be trading at currently. Once I got to Wall Street, I found this sort of new investing framework that was starting to really gain steam. You hear people talking in the news or in investing communities about things like DE&I, diversity, equity, and inclusion, or ESG, which stands for environmental, social, governance. And these are a sort of extra economic criteria that investment firms or asset managers will think about when analyzing what companies they should invest in. So rather than looking at solely a business's fundamental future prospects, they'll look at how does this business impact the environment? What are the social goals that they have? Do they support things like Black Lives Matter? Do they do things that combat systematic racism? Basically, every liberal catchword that you can think of that you hear in the news is sort of added into this investing criteria or worldview. And it's a rapidly growing force on Wall Street that's determining where capital is being allocated.
So this is a little bit scary because what you're saying is, we've heard about all this going on in the context of, let's say, the public school curriculum. We've even heard about it in terms of the federal government. They're trying to have woke propaganda in the military. But what you're saying is that a lot of people who have money on Wall Street, or they have money on Wall Street that is through their pension funds, that all this big capital is now itself being kind of ideologically steered. And my question is, you're saying it's becoming pretty pervasive. Does this mean that the reputation of Wall Street as being somehow, right-wing and captive to capitalism? The left is they have a public hostility to Wall Street, Occupy Wall Street, is actually a misnomer because Wall Street is kind of in bed with these guys.
Right. I think that's exactly right. And that's partly why it's so pernicious, is that you don't see it quite as explicitly as you do, for example, when you see a politician promoting Black Lives Matter or promoting abortion morality, right? What these companies are doing is all behind the scenes. We can see woke companies in front of us every day. And oftentimes what we hear about is that, these companies are run by ideologues. And maybe that is an issue. Some corporate management, some CEOs, some CFOs are ideologues, and that's a problem. But what really is going on behind the scenes are the people who pull the strings, the people who own the companies, which are the shareholders, are influencing the management of these companies to pursue the ideological goals that they agree with, right? So whenever you see Disney, for example, putting out some woke film, or Coca-Cola getting involved in Georgia's election laws, need to think about not just the people running those businesses, but who's behind the scenes. What are the shareholders saying, and why would they be saying that? What we found is there's this really growing accumulation of capital in only a few investment firms. think about a company like BlackRock, $10 trillion in assets, Vanguard, State Street. Together, some of these massive investment funds hold over half of the equity value of the S&P 500 in only those big three companies. So what you see is a massive accumulation of economic power that gives these people the ability to influence companies to pursue whatever political or ideological goals they specifically desire.
Now, why would a company like Vanguard, which has been a pretty staid company, I mean, I guess long time based in Pennsylvania, if I remember the former CEO, John Bogle, seemed to be a pretty conservative guy. Why would a company like Vanguard want to risk its reputation as a kind of assiduous kind of protector of your money by going woke and saying, we're going to look at all these non-monetary criteria? Why would it do that?
I think there's really two reasons that they do that. The first is simply the people who run these companies. Remember, Wall Street investors typically come from the same places, and they typically have very similar ideological worldviews. They're almost exclusively drawn from elite left-wing universities in the US. And then whenever you meet these people, you find that they're almost all slightly center-right economically, and then politically very left-wing. And religiously, they tend to be quite secular. So the worldview is somewhat monolithic. And that's the worldview that they're increasingly wanting to pressure companies that they invest in to follow. So that's one problem. The second problem is that it allows these companies to cover up other things that they're doing, for example, in China or other emerging markets, with this veneer of social respectability. So take Disney as a great example. They can invest billions and billions and billions of dollars in China. We see all kinds of companies investing enormous amounts of money in the Chinese market, propping up the CCP, investing in companies that allow the CCP to spy on their citizens or to invest in military weaponry that the CCP is using. They can do that abroad, keep that separate, and then in the United States, they can virtue signal about how they're pursuing goals of racial equity, or they're trying to have more inclusive abortion laws or things like that. So it creates this kind of veneer of morality that really hides some of the things that they're doing elsewhere.